right, get ready, because today we're doing a deep dive into something pretty amazing: the role of copper in wound healing.
Oh, interesting.
You sent over this collection of research articles, even some clinical case reports, and
Yeah.
I gotta say, I'm intrigued.
Yeah.
Is copper like the secret weapon we've been overlooking all this time?
It's funny you say secret weapon because we tend to think of copper for its germ fighting abilities, right?
Right, right.
Like doorknobs, countertops.
Yeah.
But these sources, they go way beyond that. They
Okay.
show how copper actively participates in the body's own healing processes. It's not just
Yeah.
about keeping things clean. It's about actually mending and rebuilding.
Right. That's what I thought was so interesting. And one of the things that really jumped out at me was copper's role in producing collagen and elastin.
Right.
And we need those for healthy skin anyway.
Yeah.
But how does that play into healing a wound specifically?
Okay, so think of it like this. Your skin is like a building, okay? And it's been damaged. Collagen is like the steel framework.
Yeah.
It provides the structure. And elastin, that's kind of the concrete, that fills the gaps, allows for flexibility.
Okay.
So when you have a wound, your body needs to repair that damage.
Right.
And copper is essential for making and delivering those crucial building materials.
So copper's kind of like the construction manager, making sure all the right materials are in place.
Exactly. But it doesn't stop there.
Oh!
So remember those roads we were just talking about?
Yeah.
Copper is also essential for building new blood vessels, a process called angiogenesis.
Right, right. Angiogenesis.
Yeah, and these vessels, they're like the supply routes. They bring oxygen, nutrients to the damaged area. Without those supplies, the construction crew can't do their job effectively.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah,
And when we're talking wounds, especially chronic wounds, efficient healing is critical. And that's where I thought some of these clinical cases were really interesting,
yeah,
especially that one with the diabetic patient facing amputation.
yeah. That particular case, I thought it was such a powerful example of copper's potential. So you have this patient whose initial healing after a toe amputation, it just wasn't going well.
Yeah.
Standard wound care just wasn't getting the job done.
Wow.
But when they switched to dressings with copper oxide, infection cleared, new skin began to grow,
Yeah.
and get this, the wound completely closed.
Wow. Okay, that's remarkable. It makes you wonder, why aren't copper dressings more common if they can have such a dramatic impact? What's the science behind all of this? Because one of the studies mentioned copper influencing this protein called HIF1.
Right.
What is that, and how does it fit into all of this?
So HIF1, it might sound a little complicated,
Yeah.
but it's like the foreman on that construction site we were talking about.
Okay.
So when there's an injury, especially in a deep wound where the oxygen levels are low, HIF1 is activated.
Right.
It's like a signal flare, right? Alerting the body to spring into action.
Okay.
And guess what? Copper seems to amplify that signal.
So more copper equals stronger signal, which means faster response from the body's repair crews.
That's the idea, yeah.
Wow.
And this is where things get even more interesting.
You were saying that things were about to get even more interesting.
Oh, right.
Don't leave me hanging.
Okay.
What else do these sources say about copper and its role in healing?
So we've talked about copper's role in building collagen, elastin, blood vessels, right?
Right.
But these sources also highlight something really crucial,
Okay.
the timing of these processes.
The timing.
Yeah, it turns out that different stages of wound healing, well, they require different approaches.
Okay.
And copper seems to be really good at orchestrating that delicate balance.
Okay, so walk me through that. What are these different stages and how does copper fit in?
All right, so imagine a wound as a construction project again.
Okay.
In the initial phase, right after the injury, the focus is damage control. So there's inflammation, and your body sends in the first responders. Immune cells to clean up debris, fight infection.
Right.
Then, as things start to stabilize, the focus shifts to rebuilding. That's where collagen, elastin production, it ramps up. Blue blood vessels form.
Okay.
And finally, you have the remodeling phase. So that's where the newly formed tissue, it matures, strengthens.
That makes sense. So where does copper come in? All these different stages.
It seems like it.
Yeah.
What's fascinating is that copper appears to influence the inflammatory response itself. Remember those signaling molecules we talked about, the ones that tell your body how to react to an injury?
Yeah.
Well, copper seems to help regulate their levels.
Okay.
prevents the initial inflammation from going overboard.
So it's like copper is making sure the demolition crew doesn't get too carried away before the rebuilding can begin.
Yes, that's a great way to put it. And this is actually where the research gets really specific.
Okay.
One of the studies measured levels of certain cytokines. Those are the signaling molecules.
Right.
And they did this in skin samples. They found that copper actually reduced the levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines, which are the ones that can cause excessive swelling and damage if they're around for too long.
Interesting. So it's not just about promoting healing, it's about making sure that healing happens in the right way at the right time.
Exactly. And here's another layer to this.
Okay.
Remember we talked about silver being a common ingredient in wound dressings?
Right, right.
Well, one of the sources you provided actually highlighted a potential downside to silver when it comes to long-term healing.
Oh, right. I was wondering when we were going to circle back to that. Yeah, I thought silver was supposed to be good for wounds. What's the issue?
So silver, it's undoubtedly effective at killing bacteria,
Right.
which is obviously crucial in the early stages of wound care.
Right.
But this research, it suggests that silver might actually hinder angiogenesis, that process of building new blood vessels.
Really?
Yeah,
That's so interesting because we were just talking about how important blood vessel formation is for healing. So it's like silver takes care of that initial infection, but then it might actually be slowing down the long-term repair work.
that's the potential downside they highlight, yeah. Now, this doesn't mean that silver dressings are bad,
Right.
but it suggests that maybe they're not ideal for all stages of wound healing.
Okay.
You know, there might be a point where switching to a different approach, like using a copper dressing, could be beneficial.
Yeah, it's all about finding the right tool for the job, right?
Right.
And it seems like copper might be the better choice for supporting that long-term reconstruction phase. But before we get too carried away praising copy, we have to talk about safety. Did the research address that at all?
Absolutely, yeah. And you'll be glad to hear that the studies, they consistently showed that copper oxide dressings, they didn't cause any irritation, any harm, even with extended use.
Okay.
They appear to be quite safe.
Okay, good. That's really good to know. That's reassuring.
Mm.
So copper fights infection, promotes healing, safe to use. Really starting to sound like the ultimate multitasker.
I know, right?
There's something else I was curious about, though.
Yeah.
One of the studies you sent over, it mentioned using skin from abdominoplasty procedures,
Right.
tummy tucks,
Yeah.
to study burn healing.
Yeah, it's an interesting method.
It seems like a very unusual approach.
It is. It is an interesting method.
Yeah.
They were focusing on an area called the zone of stasis. And this is that region surrounding a burn that's damaged, but it's not completely dead.
Okay.
So think of it like the battleground where your body is fighting to save as much tissue as possible.
Okay, so they're looking at that critical area, right, on the edge of a burn.
Right.
What did they find?
So they intentionally inflicted burn wounds on these skin samples, and then they treated some with copper ions. And what they observed was fascinating. The samples treated with copper showed significantly less tissue damage and much faster healing compared to the untreated burns.
Wow. So the copper wasn't just speeding up the healing process, it was actually preventing further damage in that really vulnerable zone.
Right, exactly.
That's impressive.
Yeah, and it just further highlights that potential of copper to actively participate in the body's own defense and repair mechanisms.
Mhm.
The researchers were even able to measure those specific signaling molecules we were talking about, the cytokines,
Right.
within those skin samples. And they found that copper not only reduced those harmful pro-inflammatory cytokines, but it also boosted the levels of the ones that promote tissue repair later on.
So copper's not just a one-trick pony. It's like it understands the different phases of wound healing and adapts its approach accordingly.
That's a great way to think about it.
That's really cool.
Yeah. And it kind of raises an important question.
Okay.
If copper is so crucial for this really intricate dance of healing, what happens when our bodies don't have enough of it?
That's a really good question. You know, we've been talking about all these amazing things copper can do for wound healing.
Right.
But what happens if someone's deficient in copper?
Hmm.
Could that actually, like, slow down their recovery?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's something researchers are really actively investigating.
Yeah.
We don't have all the answers yet,
Okay.
but it stands to reason if copper is essential for these processes, then not having enough could definitely hinder things.
Right. It's like trying to build a house without enough nails or lumber.
Exactly.
You might be able to cobble something together,
Yeah.
but it's not going to be as strong or stable.
Right. And when you think about chronic wounds, you know, those that just don't seem to heal properly. And
Yeah.
it makes you wonder, if copper deficiency or even just poor copper availability at the wound site might be playing a role.
That's fascinating. It's like a vicious cycle almost. Like a chronic wound might lead to low copper levels, which then makes it even harder for the wound to heal.
Right? It's this complex puzzle, and there's still so much we don't know.
Right.
Factors like diet, age, underlying health conditions, those can all affect how much copper our bodies can even access.
Yeah, that's true.
And then there's the wound environment itself.
Oh, right.
Chronic wounds often have poor blood flow,
Right.
which could limit the delivery of copper to where it's needed most.
Right. It really highlights how interconnected everything is. It's not just about slapping on a bandage. We have to consider the whole system.
Hmm.
Speaking of bandages, though, we've talked a lot about these copper oxide dressings,
Right.
but I'm curious about the specifics. Like, what are they actually made of?
So one of the sources you provided, they actually went into some detail about how these dressings are constructed.
Okay.
They often have like a two-layer design.
Okay.
The inner layer, it's usually this super absorbent material.
Okay.
It's made from things like viscose and rayon fibers.
Okay.
And a small percentage of those fibers are actually plated with copper oxide.
Plated. So they coat the fibers themselves with copper.
Precisely.
Okay.
And that outer layer that's typically like a more protective non-stick fabric, like polypropylene,
Okay.
which is also infused with copper oxide particles.
So you've got copper kind of working from the inside out, ensuring a steady release of those beneficial ions right where they're needed. It's like slow release fertilizer for wounds.
That's a great analogy. And the research really seems to back up their effectiveness. One study, they directly compared these copper dressings to a commercially available silver dressing
Okay.
using a diabetic mouse model.
Okay.
And the
Yeah.
copper dressing, they significantly outperformed both the control dressings and the silver dressings when it came to wound closure rates.
Wow, really?
Yeah. And it seems like that steady release of copper, it really does make a difference.
That's really impressive. So we've got like centuries-old wisdom meeting modern science.
Yeah.
It's amazing how something as seemingly simple as copper can be harnessed to aid our body's own natural healing abilities.
Yeah, it really speaks to the power of like deeper exploration. We often take things for granted,
Right.
like the role of just a common metal like copper.
Yeah.
But when we delve deeper,
Yeah.
we uncover these fascinating properties and applications.
Well said. This deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening. I'm definitely leaving with a newfound appreciation for copper and its potential in wound care.
Me too, me too.
Yeah.
I think that's a great note to end on, actually. It's a reminder that there's always more to discover, even in the most familiar of places.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining me on this fascinating journey into the world of copper and wound healing.
It's been a pleasure.
I'm sure our listeners will have plenty to think about and explore further. Until next time.
Sounds good.